Today we're looking at A New World on Mars by Dr. Robert Zubrin. This is a 2024 book, and it's an actual rocket scientist talking about how through maths and physics Mars could be shaped to be fit for human colonisation, which is, well, it's mad, but it's brilliant. I've actually read a couple of his already over the years. They're both very, very good. This new one is kind of an update to some of the science in these older ones, but then also a look at the economics and politics of what a future on Mars might look like, which gets kind of interesting when you get a rocket scientist talking about economics and politics. But he's a very smart man, so we'll give him some credit and we'll have a look. There seems to be a potential danger with someone who is at that level of expert in their field and has been dedicated over a lifetime to the whole thing, that it'd be easy to sort of overanalyze a situation to come up with a solution that perhaps wouldn't work practically. To be fair, he's been writing since the 90s and lots of things have been discovered about Mars since then, and he's been turned out to be right. So, this guy is definitely on the right track. But there's things like he says that Mars would be a great place to develop real estate because there's a lot of land. Okay, yeah, a lot of land. No air, not much gravity, lots of radiation, not very warm. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that he's wrong because of that. I just mean that it's one of the lesser arguments you'd think. There's a lot of land. There's a lot of land on the moon too, but it's not sure we want to live there. There's also a comment that necessity is the mother of invention. Yep, sure. So Martians will invent a lot of stuff. It's like, yeah, they'll invent a lot of stuff, or they'll all choke to death, like Arnold Schwarzenegger in that dream in Total Recall. So it might not be the case that everything is absolutely as he's going to say, and predictions don't work like that, do they? I mean, if you can predict 100 things, you might get 4 of them, sort of thing. So the broad shape, sure, it sounds like no one's going to know more about this stuff than this guy. But yeah, some of those little details, that could be a little bit tricky, I wonder. There's a surprising idea in the book. Well, there's several surprising ideas in the book, actually, that he boils down the reason why we should go to Mars. The reason for that is liberty. Oh, okay. I sort of instinctively rejected that as unreasonable. I was just like, that's stupid. That doesn't make any sense. But then the more I thought about it, it's like, okay, actually, yeah, perhaps he's right. That does make a lot of sense. I mean, it's not for the view, is it? And it's certainly not for the wildlife and all the rest of it. So yeah, I guess it would make sense that it is going to be for the liberty. In part of that, he also raised an interesting point that never occurred to me, that there's 2 different words in English for basically everything. You've got the Saxon word and the Norman word. I'm going to forget which way round they are. But yeah, basically one being the polite, formal version, and one being the more direct. So you can acquire or you can take, sort of thing. I'd never registered that before, which is interesting and completely unrelated to space, obviously, but you take things you can learn where you find them. That's all fine. The politics bit gets interesting though, because he comes up with a bunch of extra rights that should be instigated on Mars. He lists 10 that are based in America, from the Constitution, all the rest of it, and then lists another 17 that should be on Mars. And I don't want to get nitpicky because I don't think it's particularly interesting what those rights are necessarily. But it is important to bear in mind when you're talking about rights, of course, that it's one person's rights and the other person's responsibility. It's kind of, you can't get away from 2 halves of that. If you have a right, that puts an imposition on me to treat you a certain way. And obviously if it's not kill you or not burn your house down, fine. But there comes a point where it starts to get a little bit less fine. And I think probably a reason why the American rights is defined, not vague, but they're quite, there's not many of them and they're quite big picture sort of thing. It's because the more detail you get into, the more problematic and complicated rights are going to get. So I'm not objecting to what any of his rights should be. I don't particularly find that particularly interesting what other people think their rights should be. Just because that's just a matter of opinion, or at least it's a matter of opinion unless you have some sort of overarching sense of external validation for them. But it's very interesting, the idea that you could set up somewhere completely external to Earth, set a bunch of rights and principles on it, and then people could choose whether or not they want to go and live there by those rights and principles. I really like that. I'm not sure whether I would do it, but it's a very interesting idea. He makes an interesting point as well about genetically modified food being good. I don't know anything about that sort of thing, but in my head, genetically modified was sort of a buzzword for bad, and was something we were all trying to avoid. We want natural and all the rest of it. But he makes the sort of logical sounding point that the reason they're genetically modified is to make them more nutritious and safer. So they're better. Right? Okay, that sounds reasonable. I'm not going to change anything I'm doing with my carrots because of a rocket scientist, but it's interesting food for thought. Pun intended, I suppose, yeah, to be fair. He also has a great thought about getting nuclear weapons and using them to blow up the ice at the North Pole. Is it the South Pole? It's definitely on the North Pole, at Mars, and using that to help terraform the planet and get more carbon dioxide and water vapour into the atmosphere to get the pressure up and then get the temperature up. Unfortunately, he rules out that it's not going to work because there's a very high risk you're just basically going to destroy the planet, so which I suppose is perhaps should have been obvious. But I love that he considered that and then did the maths to work it out. I'm not into maths like that, don't get me wrong. That's a bit weird, but I love that people can do that. That's brilliant. So yeah, there you go. He went and did that and decided that no, that's not a good idea to use up all the world's nuclear weapons by sending them to Mars to melt ice. He does also solve the mystery for us of how much energy the whole human race uses, and apparently it's 20,000 gigawatts. So that somewhat puts Doc Brown's 1.21 gigawatts in perspective. It's interesting that, isn't it? Talking about gigawatts. Clearly before everything was giga this and giga that. So clearly Back to the Future thought we were going down the gigabyte route as opposed to the gigabyte. So yeah, it's quite interesting. So yeah, but 20,000 gigawatts, apparently awful lot of power. But when Mars invents nuclear fusion, everything will be fine, apparently. I don't think that number really means anything to me. I don't really understand it at all, but I like the fact that we know that. Finally, he makes the point that there are no such thing as natural resources, which is delightfully controversial, isn't it? But his argument is that there are only raw materials, and then it's human ingenuity that turns them into natural resources. And I think, well, that's brilliant, isn't it? I think you can't really argue with that. I guess it's probably not going to change the common usage of the word natural resources. But yeah, that scientific brain acknowledging that it's humans that have turned, oil at one point was just something that was ruining farmers' crops, just oozing out the ground, making a mess. And then it's human ingenuity that turned it into the thing that basically drives the world, arguably, I suppose. So that's brilliant. And it's him applying his big old brain to finding some way to drive humanity forward and do the next thing. And you kind of like, go scientists. I love that. So much these days seems to be celebrating success because someone's built some massive website that just fries your brain on dopamine or gets your stuff delivered to you very quickly. I love Amazon too. So. But yeah, someone still writing books about doing stuff, that meaningful stuff. That's absolutely fantastic. So yeah, definitely all of his books well worth the read. Although do be very careful with Mars Direct, because I paid a normal price for that and it turned out it's that big. So it's Case for Space, Case for Mars, and the New World on Mars. Brilliant.